Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now, today we're going to be talking about communication research methods and a little bit on signs and symbols. Really, for this lecture, we're going to get into communication research and what the processes are behind communication research. Now, for many of you reading this, or viewing this for that matter, it's very likely that you'll probably never read or write an entire academic journal article. Many of them are very cumbersome. They can be very difficult to get through. Most people speed read through these articles. However, these articles that are published by scholars and other people are very, very important when we think about communication research. Additionally, a lot of what we do in the academic sphere of communication research does mirror what is done in industry. Focus groups are executed in industry as in academia. That goes the same for surveys, it goes the same for experiments, content analysis, and a lot of multivariate analyses as well. And so in this lecture, what I'm hoping to do is to kind of provide a practical angle for a lot of the theories that we're going to be looking at today. So let's dive right in. So where does knowledge come from? It's kind of important to think about where knowledge comes from before we start thinking about how we further knowledge, how we test hypotheses, and how we explore research questions. So authority is a big portion of where knowledge comes from. We have authority figures throughout society, politicians, police, other government officials that inform who we are, what we do, and what we know. Right? We are born into this world, and we are told that Christmas falls on December 25th. We're told when there are certain holidays. We're told certain laws and rules and regulations, and so we are very much informed by authority. Additionally, we also have intuition, knowing something without evidence. Intuition may be when you were 3 or 4 years old, you might have accidentally kicked someone. And granted, maybe nobody had the opportunity to tell you yet that it's wrong to kick, but once you made contact with somebody, it's highly likely that you felt guilty, and you may have even said sorry. We have kind of an intuition as human beings, knowing that generally speaking, it's obviously wrong to hit someone, it's obviously wrong to steal from someone. So this kind of intuitive knowledge that we have is something that we're born with to an extent. Additionally, we have experience, previous activities. That informs our knowledge. When we formulate an opinion about Will Smith, we think about the movies that he's been in. Same thing with Meryl Streep. Same thing with watching LeBron James play basketball. Our opinion of him may sway based on the previous games that we've watched. And additionally, we have research, systematic collection and evaluation of evidence. I myself, as a PhD, am part of this final lever of where knowledge comes from. It's a very slow and steady process compared to the other three. Authority figures, experience, and intuition can be gained rather quickly in comparison to research, as scholars' entire life might be dedicated to really one minute area of research. I myself have dedicated my life to media management and entertainment research, considering the consumer behavior, branding, and marketing behind TV, video games, and film. And granted, in my lifetime, I may publish 30 to 40 studies, hopefully more. But even with all of those studies, while I furthered knowledge, it's not as much as you may think. It takes a very long time to understand our world. It takes a very long time to test and support and unsupport hypotheses, and it takes a very long time to investigate research questions. So knowledge is incumbent upon previous knowledge, especially in the research sphere. The world continues to change, and so we must change alongside with it by conducting research. Let's go to the next slide. Be skeptical. Not all knowledge is equal, as the owl is grilling you guys as you're watching this. Most reliable form of knowledge is definitely from research. It's really important to understand this because research is based upon scholars who have conducted tons and tons of research in the past. When I formulate a research study, I look at what's been done before. What are scholars doing differently that they haven't done in the past? And so for me, it's really incumbent on me to make sure that I've done my due diligence and looked around to see what have previous scholars done here. Additionally, it's really important to look for gaps in research. What might I mean by gaps? You might want to look for logic gaps. You might want to look at, does this study make sense? Do the variables make sense? Does the theory make sense? Does anything that this scholar is claiming to have found really appear in the study? And so it's important when you read some sort of academic study, not just to take it for what it is. Oh, this must be true because it's published. Have a critical, skeptical eye with everything that you read. I always read with skepticism when I'm reading an academic journal. It might make me a pessimist to some extent, but you should have that lens when you're going through academic articles. Remember, no study is 100%. None of my work is 100%. I happen to think my studies are very good, but I also know that they're not perfect, not by any stretch of the imagination, especially in the social sciences. So it's really important when we read these academic articles and think about what theories have been furthered or advanced, what really went on here. Additionally, you want to be sure of where samples and data came from. For instance, if a study puts out a survey and it's a survey for all New York State middle school principals, can we generalize the results to the U.S. population? Well, no, because if this was a randomized sampling of principals from New York State middle schools, then the population is New York State, right? We drew a sample from New York State. So another big area of academic inquiry is, what can we generalize? What can we kind of establish as some sort of foundation that we believe to be true? And so with something like that, you want to limit your findings to, well, we think that this might be generalizable for all New York State middle school principals, not United States middle school principals. We would have had to do a sampling, a random sampling, from a list of all U.S. middle school principals in that case. Let's move on. Peer-reviewed process. So an academic submits a study to a journal for peer review. I've done this probably almost a dozen times at this point. So the goal here is to have others assess your work. Typically, it's 3 scholars that have related fields that are reviewing your work. Many rewrites are necessary to get published, though. Why? Well, I myself have only had one publication on the first submission, which is incredibly rare to do, and frankly is far from the norm. And so the point here is that when somebody evaluates your work, those of you who are interested in writing and publishing and and furthering on communication theoretical work, it's important that people look at what you're trying to pursue and if you reached it. So if your goal is to better understand video game nostalgia or consumers who watch movies, you want to be sure that your measurements make sense, your variables make sense, the way that you're measuring audiences makes sense. Did you do a focus group here? Why or why not? Did you do a survey? Why or why not? Did you do an experiment? Why or why not? And so with everything that you do in a study, as we're going in this lecture, it'll make a little bit more sense. Everything you do in a study has to be outlined. And so as great as I might think my work is, some scholars may get back to me after they've edited one of my journal articles to say, well, you really need to expand upon the theory that you used here, or you can cut some theory, or you need to better operationalize this variable. You said that you were working with brand loyalty, but you didn't really define what you meant by brand loyalty. Or what were your implications for industry? Being a media management scholar, a lot of the journals I submit to are media management-esque. And so they're always looking for, well, it's great that you did this study, but what's the industry implications? How does this impact industry as we speak right now? And so these are things to kind of consider as you're putting together an article. And in this class, I will be sharing with you one of my recent publications just to kind of give you an idea of what's involved in a finished academic article. Let's move on. So, poking holes in an academic study. Scholarly research is precise. Definitions of variables and theories must be clearly stated and written well. Might there be knowledge gaps? That's very, very important to note, because the way in which a study is written, there's an introduction that explains why the study is important. Why are we studying video game nostalgia in 2018? It's one of the current things I'm looking at. Well, it's been 30 years since the modern video game era, post-Nintendo, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Many of the consumers are now of age with a lot of discretionary spending, and they're still playing video games. And so this is kind of the first time in which we're really able to study how nostalgia appears among video game players, how it's involved in the video game play experience. And so from all of those things, I'm able to kind of make an argument if there is a knowledge gap. Yeah, you know what? We really haven't studied video game nostalgia in the past. This is a great opportune time to do so. So I might cite studies in my introduction to demonstrate the gap in knowledge. Fine. An academic reviewer may also consider many different possibilities at play for the result of a study. So I might make a claim that demonstrates something. An academic scholar or reviewer may come in and say, well, I'd like to see another data chart. I'd like to see something else to help support what you're trying to argue for. And then really a good academic researcher will take the feedback and implement it into the journal article. It is up to you how much you put into your own study. And this is something that I grapple with, a lot of other academics grapple with. It's difficult when you get reviews back for the scholarly work that you do because they're suggestions. Now, granted, I probably implement 85 to 90% of what journal editors tell me. I really don't fight them on things unless I think their claims are out of the scope of the article. For instance, one journal editor wanted me to talk about virtual worlds, like 3D worlds, in a study about active emotional management through video gameplay. It probably didn't make sense to do it because I kind of felt that that discussion would fall out of the scope of the study. So that's simply what I responded with for that particular comment. And so it's important, and I hope you're starting to see how important it is for academics really to get things right, really to take your time, and really to be precise with everything that we do to the best of our ability. And so the peer review process is daunting, it is very difficult, but when you can get something published, you have a tremendous appreciation for the process itself. Let's move along. So the process of scholarship, you're generating hypotheses and research questions. A hypothesis is a statement for those of you who still may be a little unclear. A hypothesis states a relationship between at least two variables. So it could be something along the lines of, as a student studies for an exam, he or she will earn a higher grade, right? Studying for the exam is the independent variable. The grade on the exam is the dependent variable. And then we have defining variables and concepts as well. For some of you, you may define the uses and gratifications paradigm in some of your work. So that might be discussing why uses and gratifications may apply here. That's an approach that states the audience is active. They use media for anticipated gratifications, and they are actively making these decisions as they move along in their media consumption. Moreover, you have to identify types of data. What kind of data are you using? If you are trying to understand themes that come out in Modern Family, which could be along the lines of, do they talk about racism on Modern Family? Do they talk about the LGBTQ community on Modern Family? Do they talk about wealth on Modern Family? Your type of data is probably going to be watching episodes. You'll probably pick, 50 or so episodes to watch, and you'll probably measure as you're watching each episode, you'll write down the amount of times wealth is discussed or racism is discussed or whatever it may be. Additionally, you want to be sure that you're clear with what hypotheses and research questions are involved in the study. And so if you're interested in understanding why people use tablets to watch movies, you'll probably use the uses and gratifications approach in the very beginning of your article to discuss how uses and gratifications explains the process of how consumers pick certain platforms to watch movies on. That kind of makes sense, right? And so hypotheses and research questions help really distill and refine the focus of the study. And they're kind of like rules or boundaries. Your study is within this kind of scope, the only things that you're testing or investigating. And then Finally, in the article, you will draw conclusions and discuss advancement of theory as well as industry implications if applicable. Given that I'm a media management scholar, I'm always interested in how my studies may impact industry. Let's move along. What types of research are there? There is quantitative and there is qualitative. And so quantitative research deals with numbers. We know that quantity, so it's related to numbers in that manner. And so we have reductionist numerical listed there as well, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about when we think of quantitative research, which also encompasses survey, content analysis, and experiment, among others. Why would I say that quantitative research is reductionist in nature? Well, kind of is. If you think about it, if I asked you how you were doing, you probably wouldn't answer me on a scale of 1 to 5 and say 4. We don't go around to our friends and saying, oh, hey, Robert, how you feeling? 3. Nobody responds that way. We don't really think that way. We might go into heavy detail about how our day's going. The train was late, the subway was late. I got in and my boss was already frustrated that we haven't been able to get our projects out on time, things like that. And so with quantitative research, it's kind of a way in which to get a lot of data quickly by forcing people to answer in numerical fashion. On a scale of 1 to 7, how satisfied are you with the HBO channel that you subscribe to? On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you disagree or agree with the following statements? And so those are kind of examples of survey questions that you might deal with. Content analysis may be that you're watching video or you're reading a book or you're reading scripts, and you might note or count the number of times, again, a theme might come up. You know, how many times is racism brought up in The Office, or how many times is power structures brought up on the show Blackish? And so that might be, those are examples of content analyses. And then finally, with experiments, you might test people's reactions to certain stimuli. So you might set up an example in which consumers read a sad passage and a happy passage or no passage. And so you kind of have some sort of emotional manipulation there. And then you might give them the option of playing a nostalgic Super Mario video game or a modern Super Mario video game, and then kind of see how people's preferences shift based on the emotional state that they're in, which is something that I'm currently working on myself. That's an example of an experiment in which you're kind of measuring how people respond and evaluate their senses and knowledge based on being exposed to certain stimuli or stimulus. And so those are examples of quantitative research, and they're very, very valuable. But as you can imagine, it's kind of difficult when you're trying to really understand the how and why behind a process. This is why we have qualitative research. Qualitative research deals with interviews, talking to people about why they like Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts. Focus groups, running a focus group, which could be 6 to 8 people at a table, and you're talking about why you like Bravo or why you like WWE or why you like certain programs or channels. Do you like guilty pleasure content? Do you not like guilty pleasure content? Why? Those kinds of questions, how and why questions, are very, very useful for academics as well as industry professionals in trying to understand the appeal of particular services and products out there. And so that's kind of an overview of some of the methods that are out there for scholars and for industry people alike. Let's move on. So with focus groups, I alluded to this earlier, it's very simple. Pretty much looks like the picture itself. You'll have a moderator, somebody who's at the front of the table or the head of the table, and he or she will be guiding 6 to 8 people along to establish a group dynamic. A group dynamic is when everybody is talking about a product or service. It's kind of a conversation that erupts. That's really the main goal of a moderator. You're not there to participate in the conversation so much. You're really there to guide it, to encourage people to speak, and to make sure that all opinions are noted during the focus group session, and that it's a thorough investigation. You want to make sure that you're asking follow-up questions. If somebody tells me during a focus group session, yeah, you know, I really only like non-guilty pleasure TV, but sometimes I'll flip to Bravo, That's really interesting. Bravo is a very guilty pleasure-esque TV channel. And so if somebody is telling me that they may very well go there for other things, I'm going to ask a follow-up question myself. Oh, Roberta, that was really interesting. When you mentioned earlier that you go to Bravo, even though you don't like guilty pleasure TV, why do you go to Bravo? Oh, well, you know, they actually have Top Chef. That's kind of one of the few shows that I watch on that channel. I wish they provided more. That's a really interesting insight. You wouldn't necessarily have that if you didn't ask follow-up questions. So how and why questions are really useful here. You know, you might have anomalies or weird things that come up in experiments or surveys. Focus groups, you're able to ask people and to get better context sometimes for your results if you're able to do quantitative and qualitative research for a particular study. Let's move along. Structured versus unstructured. When you have a focus group itinerary or interview guide, as it were, you may have a structured approach. And so if you are running focus groups for Honda and they're trying to figure out the best kind of steering compatibility for their latest SUV, you might stick with the structured approach. Why? Well, if you're doing work for Honda and there's 3 focus groups and you're asking people about their experiences steering Honda cars, or maybe they've already driven a Honda car and now you're asking them questions, a structured approach states that you really don't deviate from the interview guide. The interview guide is what you ask. If I say something interesting in your focus group, you really can't ask me a follow-up question. And so a structured approach is good because all questions on the interview guide are asked across all 3 focus groups. You're able to see patterns and you can make comparisons between focus groups a little bit more easily. However, a lot of people vouch for the unstructured approach. An unstructured approach is nice because you're able to ask follow-up questions in a focus group environment as the moderator. The moderator isn't asking interview question after interview question in a structured approach. Instead, he or she is able to ask follow-up questions and deviate from the interview guide if they hear something interesting from consumers. When I was doing focus group work at the University of Florida, one of the things that I was fortunate to find was that people started watching YouTube videos to learn how to do things themselves. This was some 5 or 6 years ago, just when YouTube was starting to be used to like look up stuff for that matter. If I didn't ask follow-up questions about why people used YouTube for, you know, what they used YouTube for aside from entertainment, I wouldn't have known that do-it-yourself videos were becoming really popular to learn how to fix, you know, laundry machines and fix sinks and other things like that. And so you have to really think about what you're trying to accomplish with a focus group. Is it exploratory? Are you testing a product? Are you testing a service? Its appeal to consumers? Are you testing a logo, a brand? Are you trying to figure out what appeals to people? That's really, really important. And really for focus groups, you don't really have generalizability here because it's not really a randomized sample. It's a purposive sample. You are purposely looking for people who have survived breast cancer to ask them to come into a focus group session. And usually focus groups, you might have 3 groups of 5 to 7 people. And so it's a very, very low number compared to the several hundred or even thousands you may have in a survey, for instance. And so you really do have transferability here with focus groups. This notion that the knowledge can be transferred to other studies. It is a useful foundation, but it is by no means generalizable. It is informative though, however. Let's move along. And so the site of the qualitative research area is incredibly important. The appearance, the look, the style of it is incredibly crucial here. So when I was at the University of Florida for my PhD, I was fortunate enough to do some work for Nielsen. Nielsen is the TV ratings company. They do TV ratings for TV channels and TV networks and things like that. I highly recommend that you look up Nielsen, Nielsen, sometime this week. And so Nielsen had a partnership with the University of Florida. I was very fortunate to be a part of it. And so I ran focus groups for them. Now, we had a conference room at the University of Florida that was beautiful, brand new, excellent. The chairs sat well. All the chairs were at the same level. I made sure of that. I made sure the temperature was good, the lighting was good. I made sure that people could hear me from wherever I was in the room. But when I ran one of the focus groups, I forgot something, that even at 5 o'clock on a Wednesday or Thursday, whenever it was late in the day, the room itself was near double doors to leave the communications building. So I kept hearing that as I was doing the focus group. And of course I panicked because it was like one of my first times doing this for a company, and so I was really stressed about it. But the focus group went fine. I was able to transcribe what I needed to transcribe. But it's just important to note what's going on in your environment. Remember, when you're dealing with people in a research setting, or even in any kind of setting for that matter, you want to be sure that you have a controlled environment as best as you can. Even here, as I'm recording in the studio, do you hear that? Nothing. And that's the point. If you're trying to conduct any kind of research, part of the struggle is trying to make sure that everything is controlled for. And so when you have an interview, a focus group session, any kind of research activity that you conduct, you want to make sure you have as much control over it as possible. Let's go to the next slide. And so with mapping out qualitative research, you want to think about what you need to know. You want to think about why you need to know this as well. Remember, we're trying to get into not just saying I want to do a focus group, but this notion of why do I need to know this? What am I trying to investigate here? What kind of data will answer this question? Should I be running focus groups here? Should I be running a survey here? Should I be running an experiment here? For qualitative research, you want to ask those questions to make sure that a study might be exploratory in nature, which is very helpful because that usually lends itself to qualitative inquiry. What I mean by an exploratory study is a study in an area that really hasn't had much investigation before. And so it's important to think about these questions as you're trying to put together your own study, for that matter. Let's move along. So again, mapping out qualitative research, it's important to think about who you may need access to. For me, for my own studies, I need access to adults, which is pretty easy. And so for me, if I'm doing communication research, I hire a survey company. They put out a national randomized national survey to a randomized sample, for that matter. And so I don't really need to worry about much else but for having permission from the school, making sure I have IRB, which is for another lecture, but past earning permission, I don't need to worry too much. If any of you are interested in doing communication research with children, with high school students, you'll need to talk to parents, you'll need to obtain further approval to investigate. Research does take a long time, especially when it is qualitative. And so with qualitative research, you might have an idea for it in July. You might get approval from your school or even from your place of work in September, and then running the focus groups and interviews in October, and final deliverables you may have in November or December, depending upon how busy your firm is, depending upon how quickly you can work as an academic. There was a Current Bravo project that I had last year, and it was in the works since January, and I didn't have a deliverable until about June or July. And so it takes a while, there's no question about it. And so many firms out there, though, have tools and such to help speed things along fairly quickly. Much of the academic work that I wind up doing is a little bit more complex than that, so it can be a little bit more time consuming to churn out really solid, really quality research, for that matter. Let's move along. And so validity in qualitative research is important to understand here. How do you know that your study is valid? It's important to consider internal and external validity. Internal validity, considering the measurements that you're employing in your study. External validity, the generalizability that's available to you. As we said before, with qualitative research, there's not a lot of generalizability. There really is none here. And so internal validity is important here. And so one thing that you can do to ensure internal validity is respondent validity or validation. Once you have your focus group results and you've pulled out your themes, you can compare the data and findings with participants from whom you drew information from. You can go back to the focus group participants, ask them what they think of your findings. You can also do long, rich interviews to make sure that you have a ton of data to compare against. So if the same patterns in focus group 1 are appearing in focus group 2, then you can say to yourself, we have something here. And then, of course, you can always employ triangulation, mixed methods. You can employ not just a focus group to understand how people watch sports, but also a survey for that matter. Well, that's all we have the time for right now. Thank you so much for joining me on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.